In the dusty archives of Hollywood history lies a photograph so powerful, so devastating, that it transformed the most iconic cowboy in cinema history forever. John Wayne, the Duke himself, had built his legend on strength, unwavering conviction, and an image as unshakable as the western mountains he conquered on screen. But one single photograph, hidden from the world for decades, would shatter everything he thought he knew about himself, his legacy, and the price of fame. The year was 1939, and Marion Robert Morrison had just shed his birth name like an old coat, stepping into boots that would define American masculinity for generations. John Wayne wasn't just becoming an actor. He was becoming an idea, a symbol of everything America wanted to believe about itself. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice that could calm storms or start wars, Wayne embodied the frontier spirit in an age when the frontier existed only in Hollywood soundstages. But behind those steely blue eyes lay secrets that would have destroyed lesser men. Wayne's rise to stardom wasn't the smooth ascent that studio publicity machines painted for eager fans. It was a climb marked by sacrifice, compromise, and choices that would haunt him until his dying day. Little did the world know that the man who would become synonymous with unwavering moral certainty was, in reality, wrestling with demons that threatened to consume him whole. The photograph that would change everything hadn't been taken yet, but the circumstances that would make it so devastating were already falling into place like dominoes in a cosmic game of chance. Wayne's marriage to Josephine, Alicia Scenes, was crumbling under the weight of his ambition and the intoxicating allure of Hollywood's golden promises. The studio system demanded perfection, not just in performance, but in personal life, and Wayne was already learning that the price of legend was often measured in the currency of truth, dot as 1939. Turned to 1940, Wayne stood at the precipice of superstardom, unaware that his greatest triumph and his most devastating moment of reckoning were intrinsically linked. The photograph waiting in his future would force him to confront not just who he had become, but who he had sacrificed to get there. Hollywood in the 1940s was a machine designed to manufacture dreams, but for those caught in its gears, it often felt more like a beautiful prison. John Wayne found himself trapped in the golden cage of stardom, where every move was choreographed, every word scripted, and every relationship potentially monetized by the relentless publicity departments that controlled his destiny. The pressure was suffocating. Wayne's handlers demanded he embody the perfect American man, both on and off screen, a role that required him to suppress his vulnerabilities, his doubts, and most dangerously, his humanity. The Duke wasn't allowed to falter, to show weakness, or to reveal the complex, often contradictory nature of the man behind the myth. Every public appearance was a performance, every interview a carefully crafted piece of propaganda designed to sell movie tickets and maintain the illusion. Behind closed doors, Wayne struggled with the weight of expectation. His personal relationships suffered as the demands of his career consumed everything in their path. Friends became distant memories. Family time became scheduled photo opportunities, and genuine connection became increasingly elusive. The man who portrayed unwavering strength on screen was quietly fracturing under the pressure of living up to an impossible ideal. It was during this period of intense scrutiny that Wayne began to understand the true cost of fame. Every decision, every relationship, every private moment existed under the threat of public exposure. The photograph that would eventually change his life was still years away, but the paranoia and hypervigilance that would make its impact so devastating were already taking root. Wayne lived in constant fear that his carefully constructed image might crumble, that the world might see past the cowboy hat and discover the vulnerable, imperfect human being underneath. The irony wasn't lost on him. The more successful he became, the more isolated he felt. The more the world loved John Wayne, the more Marion Morrison seemed to disappear, buried under layers of manufactured persona and studio-mandated perfection, dot away from the cameras and the adoring crowds. John Wayne was a man caught between two worlds: the mythical figure he portrayed and the complicated reality of who he truly was. In the quiet moments between takes, when the dust had settled on another Western set and the crew had gone home, Wayne would sit alone, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. The man who had become America's symbol of moral certainty was privately tormented by the gray areas of his own life. His relationships were complicated, messy affairs that bore little resemblance to the clean, heroic narratives his films promoted. Wayne's personal code, the one that guided him through life's more challenging moments, often conflicted with the black and white morality his characters embodied on screen. Family gatherings became exercises in performance art, with Wayne struggling to reconcile his role as Hollywood royalty with his desire to simply be a father and husband. His children watched their father transform from the man they knew at home to the larger-than-life figure the world expected him to be. The transformation was so complete, so seamless, that sometimes even Wayne forgot where the performance ended. And the real man began. It was in this vulnerable state that Wayne made choices about loyalty, about love, about the price he was willing to pay for success that would later be captured in a single, devastating photograph. The image hadn't been taken yet, but the emotional landscape it would reveal was already being shaped by years of suppressed truth and mounting internal pressure. Wayne's private journals from this period, discovered decades after his death, reveal a man at war with himself. "Sometimes I wonder," he wrote in one entry, "if becoming John Wayne was worth losing Marion Morrison. But it's too late now to go back. The world needs the Duke more than it needs the truth." Little did he know that soon a photograph would make that choice irreversible. The year 1952 arrived with the promise of new triumphs for John Wayne. His career was reaching unprecedented heights, with The Quiet Man earning him critical acclaim, and proving that the Duke could handle more than just gunfights and cattle drives. But success in Hollywood has always been a double-edged sword, and Wayne was about to discover that the higher you climb, the more devastating the fall can be. It was during the filming of his next project that the circumstances leading to the photograph began to align. Wayne was working longer hours, pushing himself harder than ever before, driven by an almost desperate need to prove that his success wasn't accidental, that he deserved the adoration and respect he'd earned. The pressure was taking its toll, not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically. Behind the scenes, Wayne's personal life was reaching a critical juncture. Relationships that had been strained for years were approaching their breaking point. The careful balance he'd maintained between his public image and private reality was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Every day brought new challenges, new threats to the carefully constructed world he'd built around himself. The photograph that would change everything was still months away, but the emotional state that would make it so devastating was crystallizing with each passing day. Wayne was exhausted, vulnerable, and caught off guard by circumstances beyond his control. The man who had built his career on being prepared for anything was about to be blindsided by a moment of humanity that would be preserved forever. Those closest to Wayne during this period later described a man on the edge not of breakdown, but of breakthrough. It was as if the weight of carrying the John Wayne persona was finally becoming too much, and cracks were beginning to show in the facade. The photograph, when it came, would capture more than just an image. It would freeze a moment of raw, unguarded truth that Wayne had spent decades trying to hide. The storm was gathering, and Wayne stood directly in its path, unaware that his entire world was about to change with the click of a shutter. The photographer who would capture the image that changed John Wayne's life forever was not a paparazzi, stalker, or a scandal-seeking opportunist. Instead, It was someone Wayne trusted, a distinction that would make the photograph's eventual impact all the more devastating. The lens that would capture his most vulnerable moment belonged to someone he'd welcomed into his inner circle, someone who had been documenting the behind-the-scenes reality of Hollywood's golden age. Margaret Burke White had built her reputation as one of the most respected photojournalists of her generation. Her work for Life magazine had taken her from the industrial landscapes of America to the battlefields of World War II, and her camera had captured some of the most defining moments of the 20th century. When she was assigned to document a day in the life of Hollywood's biggest star, it seemed like just another assignment, prestigious, certainly, but routine for someone of her caliber. Wayne had agreed to the photo session because he trusted Burke White's artistic integrity and her reputation for treating her subjects with dignity. Unlike the studio photographers who crafted carefully controlled images designed to sell movies, Burke White was interested in capturing authentic moments, real emotions, and genuine human experiences. It was this commitment to truth that Wayne both admired and, ultimately, would come to fear. The session was scheduled for a quiet afternoon at Wayne's ranch, away from the chaos of Hollywood and the prying eyes of fans and studio executives. Wayne felt comfortable there, surrounded by the horses and open spaces that reminded him of his happiest childhood memories. It was meant to be an intimate portrait session, a glimpse into the private world of America's most beloved cowboy. But Burke White's camera was more perceptive than Wayne realized. Through her lens, the carefully maintained barriers between public image and private reality became transparent. She saw past the cowboy swagger to the vulnerable man underneath, past the confident exterior to the uncertainty and pain he'd been hiding for years. Not the photograph that would change everything was still hours away. But with each click of the shutter, Burke White was building toward a moment of truth that neither she nor Wayne could have anticipated. Afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the windows of Wayne's ranch house when Margaret Burke White captured the photograph. That would haunt him for the rest of his life. It happened in the space between posed shots, in one of those fleeting moments when the subject believes the camera isn't rolling, when the mask slips and reveals the person underneath. Wayne had been talking about his children, sharing a story about his youngest daughter's recent school play. For a brief moment, the weight of his public persona lifted, and the father, the man, emerged from behind the carefully constructed image. His eyes softened, his shoulders relaxed, and something approaching peace settled across his features. It was in that instant, vulnerable, unguarded, and achingly human that Burke White's camera caught him. But the photograph revealed more than just paternal tenderness. Captured in that single frame was a lifetime of suppressed emotion, years of sacrificing personal happiness for professional success, and the deep well of loneliness that fame had carved into his soul. The image showed Wayne not as the invincible hero the world knew, but as a man carrying burdens too heavy for any one person to bear. What made the photograph so devastating wasn't just what it revealed about Wayne, but when it was revealed, image would remain hidden for years, locked away in Burke White's archives, while Wayne continued to build his legend. During those years, he would become even more iconic, even more closely identified with the values of strength, certainty, and unwavering moral conviction that defined his screen persona. The photograph was a time bomb, ticking away in darkness while Wayne climbed to the peak of his fame. When it finally surfaced, it would arrive like a message from the past, a reminder that beneath the myth was a man who had paid a terrible price for his success. The world would see John Wayne, really see him for the first time, and the image would shatter decades of carefully crafted illusion. Little did Wayne know, as he continued his conversation about his daughter's performance, that his own most revealing performance had just been captured forever. In the months following the photo session, John Wayne went about his life with the confident stride of a man who believed his secrets were safe. The photograph existed, filed away in Margaret Bourke-White's extensive archives. But Wayne had no idea of its power, no inkling that a single image could contain enough truth to topple the carefully constructed empire he'd built around his persona. The demands of his career continued to intensify. Wayne found himself juggling multiple film projects, public appearances, and the ever-present pressure to maintain his image as America's moral compass. The weight of living up to his own legend was becoming almost unbearable, but he'd learned to compartmentalize, to lock away the parts of himself that didn't fit the John Wayne narrative. It was during this period that Wayne began to understand the true isolation that comes with iconic status. Friends became careful around him, always aware that they were in the presence of a living myth. Family members struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the public figure he'd become. Even his children seemed to regard him with a mixture of love and awe that created distance where intimacy should have existed. The photograph remained hidden, but its emotional truth was becoming harder to suppress in Wayne's daily life. The vulnerability that Bourke-White had captured was fighting to surface, creating internal tensions that manifested in increasingly erratic behavior. Those closest to Wayne noticed changes, moments of unexpected melancholy, flashes of anger that seemed disproportionate to their triggers, and a growing sense of restlessness that no amount of professional success could satisfy. Wayne began to drink more heavily during this period, not from addiction, but from a desperate need to quiet the voice in his head that whispered uncomfortable truths about the price of his success. The man who portrayed heroes on screen was quietly battling his own demons off screen, and the battle was taking its toll on his body, his relationships, and his spirit. The photograph waited in darkness, but its truth was already beginning to reshape Wayne's reality, preparing him for the devastating revelation that was still years away. By 1962, John Wayne had reached the absolute zenith of his career. He was not just a movie star, but a cultural institution, a symbol of American values so powerful that his opinions on politics and society carried weight far beyond the entertainment industry. He had survived the transition from supporting player to leading man, from B-movie cowboy to A-list icon, and his place in Hollywood history seemed secure. But security, Wayne was beginning to learn, was an illusion in a world where public image was everything and private truth was just another commodity to be bought and sold. The photograph that Margaret Bourke-White had taken 10 years earlier was beginning to stir in its archival grave. As Life magazine prepared a retrospective on Hollywood's golden age, the magazine's editors were looking for images that would capture the humanity behind the myth, pictures that would show their readers the real people behind the larger-than-life personas they'd created. Bourke-White's archives were a treasure trove of such moments, filled with unguarded shots of celebrities, politicians, and cultural icons caught in moments of genuine emotion. When the editors came across the photograph of Wayne, they immediately recognized its power. Here was an image that showed the most masculine figure in American cinema in a moment of profound vulnerability, his carefully constructed armor momentarily set aside to reveal the complex, wounded man underneath. It was exactly the kind of humanizing image they were looking for, but they had no idea of the earthquake they were about to trigger. Wayne had spent a decade building his legend even higher, making the contrast between his public image and private reality even more stark. The photograph would arrive not as a gentle reminder of his humanity, but as a devastating revelation of everything he'd been hiding from the world. As the magazine's publication date approached, Wayne remained blissfully unaware that his entire world was about to change. The photograph was preparing to emerge from its decade-long hibernation, carrying with it the power to transform not just how the world saw John Wayne, but how he saw himself. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March 1963. Wayne was at his ranch, enjoying one of his rare breaks between film projects, when his publicist's urgent voice crackled through the telephone line. Life magazine was planning to publish a photograph that would appear in their upcoming retrospective on Hollywood's golden age, and Wayne needed to see it immediately. What followed was a day that Wayne would later describe as the longest of his life. The photograph arrived by special courier, sealed in an envelope marked confidential, and when Wayne finally found the courage to look at it, he felt as if he were staring into his own soul. There he was, captured in a moment he'd completely forgotten, his defenses down and his heart visible for all the world to see. The image was devastating in its honesty. While Wayne had spent years perfecting the art of emotional control, the photograph revealed a man overwhelmed by love for his children, by regret for choices made, by the crushing loneliness that success had brought him. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time. A work of art that happened to be documenting his most private self. Wayne's first instinct was to kill the story, to use his considerable influence to keep the photograph from seeing print. But Margaret Burke White, now in her final years, had specifically requested that this image be included in the retrospective. She saw it as one of her finest works, a perfect example of the kind of truth-telling that had defined her career. To suppress it would be to betray everything she'd stood for as an artist. The negotiations that followed were intense and emotional. Wayne's team argued that the photograph violated his privacy, that it showed him in a context he'd never agreed to make public. But LIFE's editors countered that the image revealed nothing scandalous or damaging only humanity. In their view, it made Wayne more relatable, more admirable, not less so. As the debate raged, Wayne found himself confronting a fundamental question. Was he John Wayne, the invulnerable icon, or Marion Morrison, the vulnerable man? The photograph forced him to choose, and for the first time in decades, he wasn't sure which answer was true. In the days following the photograph's discovery, John Wayne entered a period of intense self-reflection that would fundamentally alter his understanding of himself and his place in the world. The image had captured something he thought he'd successfully hidden, not just from the public, but from himself. Now, faced with undeniable evidence of his own humanity, he was forced to confront the elaborate fiction he'd been living for decades. The photograph revealed the fault, lines in Wayne's carefully constructed identity. For years, he'd told himself that the persona was just part of his job, that Marion Morrison still existed somewhere beneath the John Wayne facade. But seeing himself through Burke White's lens, he realized how completely he'd submerged his authentic self in service of his public image. The man in the photograph looked like a stranger, vulnerable, emotional, and achingly real. Wayne spent hours studying the image, trying to remember the moment it was taken, trying to recall what he'd been feeling when his guard had slipped so completely. Gradually, the memories returned, thoughts of his children, regrets about time lost, fears about a future that seemed increasingly uncertain despite his professional success. The photograph had captured all of it, preserving a moment of truth that Wayne had tried to forget. The crisis deepened as Wayne realized that publication of the photograph would force him to acknowledge publicly what he'd been denying privately, that he was human, flawed, and struggling with the same doubts and fears as everyone else. The John Wayne myth depended on invulnerability, on the belief that some men were strong enough to carry the weight of the world without breaking. The photograph threatened to shatter that myth forever. As publication day approached, Wayne found himself caught between two impossible choices: embrace the truth the photograph revealed and risk destroying everything he'd built, or fight to suppress it and continue living a lie that was slowly destroying his soul. Either path seemed to lead to a kind of death of his image or his authentic self. The photograph had become more than just an image. It was a mirror forcing Wayne to see who he really was, and the reflection was almost too painful to bear. When the Life magazine retrospective hit newsstands across America in April 1963, The photograph of John Wayne created an immediate sensation. For decades, the public had seen Wayne as an immutable force of nature, a man seemingly untouched by the ordinary struggles that plagued lesser mortals. The image of him in a moment of profound vulnerability was like watching a mountain weep, shocking, beautiful, and fundamentally transformative. The initial reaction was one of stunned silence. Fans who had grown up with Wayne as their symbol of strength and certainty didn't know how to process an image that showed their hero in such a human light. Some felt betrayed, as if a sacred trust had been broken. Others felt a deeper connection to Wayne than ever before, seeing in his vulnerability a reflection of their own hidden struggles. The media response was equally divided. Some critics praised the photograph as a masterpiece of humanizing portraiture, arguing that it made Wayne more relatable and admirable by showing that even icons had moments of doubt and emotional complexity. Others criticized Life magazine for invading Wayne's privacy, arguing that some truths were too personal to be shared with the world. Wayne himself remained silent during the initial uproar, unsure how to respond to the sudden exposure of his most private self. His publicists crafted carefully worded statements about the artistic merit of Burke White's work and Wayne's respect for her as a photographer, but they couldn't address the fundamental question the photograph raised. Who was the real John Wayne? The image sparked a broader cultural conversation about celebrity, authenticity, and the price of fame. In an era when public figures were expected to maintain perfect facades, the photograph suggested that perhaps the most heroic thing a person could do was simply be human. It challenged audiences to reconsider their relationship with their idols and their own capacity for vulnerability. As the weeks passed, Wayne watched his carefully constructed world transform around him. The photograph had changed everything, but perhaps not in the way he'd feared. In the months following the photograph's publication, something unexpected began to happen to John Wayne. Instead of destroying his career as he'd feared, the image seemed to deepen his connection with audiences. Fans began approaching him differently, not as a distant icon to be worshipped, but as a fellow human being worthy of respect and understanding. Wayne noticed the change first in the letters he received, where once fan mail had been filled with praise for his strength and heroism. Now people wrote about their own struggles, their own moments of vulnerability, their own search for meaning in a complicated world. The photograph had given them permission to see him as someone who might understand their pain, and in turn, they had given him permission to be more than just an image on a screen. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Wayne still struggled with the exposure, still felt the phantom ache of his lost privacy. But gradually, he began to see the photograph not as a betrayal, but as a liberation. For the first time in decades, he didn't have to pretend to be invulnerable. The world had seen his weakness and hadn't turned away. In fact, they'd embraced him more completely than ever before. This revelation began to influence Wayne's work in subtle but significant ways. His performances took on new depth, informed by his willingness to explore emotional complexity rather than simply projecting strength. Directors noticed the change, describing a Wayne who was more open to direction, more willing to explore the darker corners of his character's psyches. Personal relationships, too, began to shift. Family members who had felt distant from the John Wayne persona found they could connect more easily with the man the photograph had revealed. Friends felt free to be more honest with him, knowing he was no longer hiding behind an impenetrable facade. The photograph had forced Wayne to confront the artificial boundaries he'd erected between his public and private selves, and in doing so, it had begun the process of making him whole again. The man who had spent decades fragmenting himself in service of an image was slowly learning to integrate all parts of us, his identity into something more complete and authentic. The impact of the photograph extended far beyond John Wayne's personal transformation. Within Hollywood, the image sparked a broader conversation about authenticity and the toll of maintaining public personas. Other stars began to question their own carefully constructed images, wondering if the price of perfection was worth the sacrifice of their humanity. Some celebrities began to embrace a more open approach to their public lives, allowing glimpses of vulnerability that would have been unthinkable in earlier eras. The photograph had proven that audiences were hungry for authenticity, that they craved connection with the real people behind the myths. This shift would eventually contribute to the more confessional culture that would emerge in later decades. The film industry itself began to change in subtle ways. Directors and producers, seeing the positive response to Wayne's newfound emotional honesty, became more willing to explore complex, flawed characters rather than simple archetypes. The rigid masculine ideal that Wayne had embodied for so long began to give way to more nuanced representations of manhood. Wayne's own career trajectory shifted as well. While he continued to make westerns and action films, he began choosing projects that allowed for greater emotional range. His later performances were marked by a depth and complexity that reflected his personal journey toward authenticity. The photograph had not diminished his star power. It had enhanced it by adding layers of meaning to everything he did. The cultural impact was perhaps most significant. The photograph had challenged audiences to reconsider the relationship with heroism itself. Instead of seeking perfect, untouchable idols, people began to appreciate the heroism of ordinary struggle, the courage required to be vulnerable, the strength found in acknowledging weakness. Wayne became a different kind of icon, not the impossibly strong cowboy of his early career, but a symbol of the possibility for growth, change, and authentic connection. The photograph had destroyed one version of John Wayne, only to create a richer, more meaningful one in its place. As John Wayne entered the twilight of his career in the 1970s, the photograph continued to resonate in ways neither he nor Margaret Bourke-White could have predicted. The image had become more than just a moment captured in time. It had become a touchstone for discussions about authenticity, vulnerability, and the true nature of heroism. Film schools began using the photograph as a teaching tool, showing students how a single image could contain entire narratives about identity, performance, and the human condition. It became a case study in the power of photography to reveal truth, especially when that truth contradicted carefully constructed public images. Wayne himself had made peace with the photograph's legacy. In his final interviews, he would sometimes reference it as a turning point in his life, a moment when he was forced to choose between image and authenticity. He consistently chose the latter, and his later years were marked by a kind of peace that had been absent during his early career. The photograph also influenced a new generation of actors who saw in Wayne's journey a model for how to navigate fame without losing oneself. They learned from his example that true strength came not from invulnerability, but from the willingness to be seen, understood, and accepted in all one's complexity. Margaret Bourke-White, before her death in 1971, would often cite the Wayne photograph as one of her proudest achievements. She believed it demonstrated photography's unique power to capture not just appearance, but essence, not just image, but truth. The photograph had vindicated her lifelong commitment to honest storytelling through her lens. As Wayne's health began to fail in his final years, he would sometimes ask to see the photograph again. Those close to him reported that he would study it quietly, perhaps remembering the man he'd been when it was taken, perhaps marveling at the journey it had set in motion. The image that had once terrified him had become a source of comfort, a reminder of his capacity for growth and change. Even today, decades after John Wayne's death in 1979, the photograph continues to spark debate and discussion among fans, scholars, and cultural critics. What exactly did Margaret Bourke-White capture in that moment? Was it simply a tired actor caught off guard, or something more profound a glimpse into the soul of a man struggling to reconcile his public and private selves? The mystery deepens when we consider the timing of the photograph's publication. Why did it take 10 years for the image to surface? Some suggest that Burke White deliberately waited, understanding that its impact would be greater after Wayne had reached the peak of his fame. Others believe it was simply the result of editorial oversight, a powerful image lost in the shuffle of a busy magazine's archives. Wayne himself never fully explained what he was thinking in that captured moment. In interviews, he would acknowledge the photograph's importance in his life, but remained vague about the specific emotions it revealed. This reticence has only added to the image's mystique, leaving viewers to project their own interpretations onto Wayne's unguarded expression. The photograph has taken on almost mythical status in the annals of celebrity photography. It's been analyzed, deconstructed, and interpreted through countless lenses: psychological, cultural, artistic, and historical. Each generation seems to find new meaning in Wayne's vulnerable moment, new relevance to their own struggles with authenticity and identity. Perhaps the photograph's greatest mystery is its lasting power to move viewers decades after its original publication. In an age of carefully curated social media images and manufactured celebrity moments, Burke White's candid capture of Wayne's humanity feels almost revolutionary. It reminds us that beneath every public figure is a private person, struggling with the same fundamental questions that confront us all. The photograph changed John Wayne, but it also changed how we see our heroes. It suggested that true strength might lie not in perfection, but in the courage to be imperfect, not in invulnerability, but in the willingness to be vulnerable. In capturing one man's moment of truth, Burke White had revealed a truth about us all. In the end, Margaret Burke White's photograph of John Wayne stands as more than just a moment in time. It's a testament to the transformative power of truth, the courage required to be authentically human, and the possibility for redemption that exists when we finally stop hiding from ourselves. The image that Wayne once feared would destroy his legacy ultimately became the foundation for a richer, more meaningful kind of fame. The photograph reminds us that our heroes are most heroic not when they're perfect, but when they're human. It shows us that the masks we wear to protect ourselves often become the prisons that confine us, and that sometimes it takes a single moment of unwanted revelation to set us free. John Wayne's journey from manufactured icon to authentic human being offers hope to anyone struggling to reconcile their public and private selves, their aspirations and their realities, their legends and their truths. The Duke may have ridden into countless sunsets on screen, but his greatest adventure was the journey toward becoming himself. What do you think? Have you ever had a moment captured that revealed more than you intended? Sometimes the images that scare us most are the ones we need the world to see. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from Hollywood's golden age. The truth, as John Wayne learned, really can set you free even when it comes from the click of a camera shutter and the courage to finally stop pretending to be someone you're not.